Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Have you ever seen an advertisement for a new well-being program and wondered if it is actually going to work, or if it is just clever marketing trying to get you to sign up? That is exactly what we're diving into today. Researchers wanted to know if how you describe a well-being program, like calling it mindfulness, and whether you mention that the benefits aren't a sure thing, actually matters when people decide if they want to join. They did an experiment with almost 700 people to find out. And here is the surprising part. It seems like these details might not make as big a difference as you think. Think about it when you are trying to improve your well-being, whether it is your mental health, stress levels, or just feeling better overall. You see all sorts of programs advertised, from fitness classes to meditation apps to therapy. How these programs are presented to you really matters, right? The health belief model, which psychologists use, suggests that we decide whether to try something new based on how we see the benefits, how credible it seems, and what it might cost us, including our time and effort. All of this is shaped by the messages we receive. We live in a world full of messages about our health and well-being. Advertisers want to sell products, doctors and health agencies give advice, and the media reports on new findings. It is a mixed bag, and when it comes to some well-being programs, there aren't always strict rules about how claims are presented. Often have to figure out if what is being said about the program is really true and how certain the benefits are without necessarily having the scientific background to do so. Health communication research is super important here because it helps us understand what makes people engage with these programs and how to make sure people get accurate information without being misled. That is why this study looked at two specific things: how a program is labeled, like calling it mindfulness, and how they talk about the uncertainty of the results. Mindfulness has become a really popular term. While there are well-defined mindfulness-based programs that have solid research behind them, many programs using the mindfulness label might not actually meet those criteria. Yet, these programs are part of a huge global market, sometimes even promoted as a cure. All the interesting thing is, studies have shown that just calling something mindful can make people think it is more effective, even if the content is exactly the same as something without that label. This is similar to how branded medicines are sometimes perceived as better than generic ones, even if they contain the same active ingredients. The other big question is about how uncertainty is communicated. We often see programs advertising very precise numbers like reduces depression by 63% or 85% of users found it helpful. These numbers sound impressive, but in science there is always uncertainty. It means our knowledge is limited because of the way research turns out. While there are ways to rate the certainty of evidence, this information is usually for scientists, not for the general public. How this uncertainty is shared or not shared can affect how credible something seems, how people weigh risks against benefits, and their overall decisions. So, the big question is, can we tell people about the uncertainty of well-being programs without scaring them away from programs that could actually help them? Some research suggests that admitting uncertainty doesn't always hurt trust, especially if it is communicated clearly. But this research hasn't always looked at well-being programs specifically. For example, a lot of studies focus on the chance of bad things happening, like getting a disease where the cost of being wrong is high. Well-being programs are about gaining something positive, like better mental health. And research shows that people tend to feel losses more strongly than gains. So, the way we communicate uncertainty in these positive contexts might be different. This study aimed to fill that gap by looking at how labeling and uncertainty affect people's willingness to join well-being programs. Specifically, they had two main goals. First, they wanted to see if calling a program mindfulness would make people more likely to want to join compared to a general well-being program with the same described benefits. Second, they wanted to know if telling people about the uncertainty of the benefits would make them less likely to want to join. They hypothesized that mindfulness labeling would increase willingness to join, and that communicating uncertainty would decrease it. They also had a secondary guess that the uncertainty might have a bigger impact on the mindfulness label program. So, here's how they tested this. They set up an experiment with 4 different versions of an advertisement for a well-being program. The ads varied on 2 things: the name of the program, which was either mindfulness-based well-being program or just well-being program, and how the benefits were described. In one version, they gave a specific improvement percentage, like 17% improvement. In the other version, they gave a range, 5 to 35% improvement, to show uncertainty. They recruited almost 700 people from platforms like Prolific and social media. To make sure the participants were people who might actually use a workplace program, they asked if they worked at least part-time. They even framed the program as being offered at work, since many workplace well-being programs are free for employees. This way, they could focus on the marketing messages themselves without people worrying about the cost. The main thing they measured was how likely people said they were to join the program, on a scale from 1 to 100. They also asked about people's past experiences with well-being or mindfulness programs and how common mindfulness is in their community. This was to help them understand if previous experience might influence their choices. They also included some manipulation checks to make sure people understood which type of program they were seeing. For example, asking if they thought the program included mindfulness techniques. After collecting the data, they used a statistical method called ANCOVA to analyze the results. They didn't remove any data unless it was clearly problematic, like missing information. They also did some extra checks to make sure their results were reliable. A quick note on how they handled participants. They removed people who seemed like bots or were fraudulent, and those who didn't meet the basic requirements, like working enough hours. After all that, they ended up with 665 participants. The average age was about 37. Interestingly, over half of the participants hadn't been in a workplace well-being program before. Of those who had, mindfulness was the most common type. And here is a look at who was in the study, showing a good mix of ages, genders, ethnicities, and types of work and industries. Now, let's get to the results. First, they checked if their mindfulness label actually made people think the program was more about mindfulness. And yes, it did. People who saw the mindfulness label thought the program was more about mindfulness techniques than those who saw the generic well-being program label. This means their first manipulation worked. But here is where it gets interesting. When they looked at whether this labeling or the way they talked about uncertainty actually changed people's likelihood of joining the program, they didn't find much. The average likelihood of joining across all the groups was around 65%. They ran their main statistical test, and importantly, they found no significant differences in people's willingness to join based on whether the program was called mindfulness or just well-being. The flucometer for this difference, which is called the p-value, was 0.318. In science, we usually want a p-value below 0.05 to say a result is likely real and not just chance. So, this difference was too small to be considered meaningful. Similarly, when they looked at whether mentioning uncertainty about the benefits, the 5 to 35% range versus the specific 17% made a difference. They found nothing. The p-value for this effect was 0.788, which is very high, meaning there was no detectable impact from communicating uncertainty in this way. And even when they looked at whether these two factors interacted, meaning if the mindfulness label combined with uncertainty had a special effect, they found no significant interaction either. This figure here shows the average likelihood of joining for each of the 4 conditions. You can see the numbers are all pretty close together, supporting the idea that the differences weren't significant. They did a couple of other analyses, and one interesting finding emerged when they looked at people's previous experience with meditation. They found that people who had meditated more in the past were more likely to want to join the program, which makes sense. But even with this, the main effects of the mindfulness label and the way uncertainty was presented still didn't show a significant impact. So, what does this all mean? The study set out to see if calling a program mindfulness and talking about uncertainty would change people's minds about joining. And surprisingly, they didn't find strong evidence for it under the conditions they tested. This null finding about the mindfulness label is quite something, given how popular mindfulness is. It suggests that, in this particular experiment, the label itself might not be the magic persuasive tool they expected it to be. It is possible that the effect of labeling is smaller than we think, or it depends a lot on the specific context. Maybe the mindfulness fad is fading, and people are starting to look more at the actual content and mechanisms of a program, rather than just its name. On the uncertainty front, it is encouraging that communicating uncertainty numerically didn't seem to scare people away. This aligns with other research that shows transparency about uncertainty can be okay, or even good for building trust. However, the study didn't test every possible way of communicating uncertainty. For example, they used specific number ranges, perhaps different ways of framing uncertainty, like using words like likely or possible might have different effects. So while this study suggests numerical uncertainty is okay, it doesn't mean all uncertainty communication is neutral. For health education and communication, this is important. It means we shouldn't just rely on fancy labels or pretend that proven benefits are absolutely certain to get people to engage. Instead, we need to focus on clear evidence-based messages. It also suggests that we can be more transparent about the limitations of our knowledge without necessarily deterring people from participating in beneficial programs. There are ideas like using visual cues like traffic light systems for health claims, but these don't always work. Another approach is to inoculate people against misleading claims. But that is usually for misinformation. This study's contribution is showing that, at least with numbers, we can be open about uncertainty, and it doesn't seem to reduce the willingness to participate. So, what are the big takeaways here? First, when designing messages for well-being programs, be cautious about over-relying on branding or presenting benefits as guaranteed. Second, we need more research to figure out the best ways to communicate uncertainty clearly and effectively so people can make informed choices. The study implies that the persuasive power of labels and precise numerical estimates might be less than we assume, or at least more dependent on the audience and context. Now, it is crucial to remember that this was a hypothetical online experiment. People said what they would do, but their actual behavior might be different. They also didn't collect much information about where participants lived, which could influence things, and they asked people about their past meditation experience after they were randomized, so their condition might have nudged their answers a bit. Future research should definitely look at these communication strategies in real-world settings, with different groups of people, and measure actual behavior, not just intentions. Exploring different ways to talk about uncertainty and measuring things like trust and satisfaction would also be really valuable. In conclusion, this study found no detectable effect of labeling a program as mindfulness or of communicating uncertainty numerically on people's intentions to join a well-being program. This doesn't mean these things never matter, but it suggests their influence might be smaller, more context-specific, or more subtle than we often assume. For anyone involved in health education and communication, it highlights the importance of honesty, transparency, and evidence in our messaging, while also being grounded about the limitations of branding and precise numerical claims. So, what do you think? Does this surprise you? Let us know in the comments below if you found this breakdown helpful. Please give this video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science insights delivered in plain English. We'll see you in the next video.